Okay, as Natalie just said, I'm Artem. I work at Wayfair in Berlin office. Berlin is like Boston, but in Germany. I also created this little tool called React Style Guidist that you can use to create React components and share them with your team. Check this out. It's pretty cool. And now, let's talk about CSS and why writing CSS could lead to inconvenient UI. And by inconsistent UI. And by inconsistent UI, I mean something like this. We have 20 different kinds of buttons in one project, written by different developers or by different designers. You all know how it can be. Or, yes, these are textiles from one project. Or these doors. Oh, kind of the same, but the left one has an icon, the middle one has different border, all has different box shadow. Not very consistent. And I think one of the reasons is custom CSS. I did a kind of quick analysis of one of the projects I was working on at my past job, and I realized that many times we write CSS for three things. One is typography, text size, color. Second is white space, padding, and margins. And third is layout, positioning components in relation to each other. And when we write CSS, it's very easy to use different values each time. Also, different developers may use different values. And in the end, it leads to very inconsistent UI. Yeah, like this. That feeling. And I think that's because CSS is just too powerful for styling UIs. It's like punch cards. You write code one day. Actually, you don't write code. You just make holes in a piece of paper. Then you hand it to machine room, and then the next day you come to work and realize that there was a bug. And same with CSS. You create all these custom styles, and a year later you realize that you have 20 different buttons in a project. So how can we fix that? The first step would be introduction of design tokens. And design tokens are single source of truth for all the kinds of design decisions. It could be colors, it could be gradients, font sizes or spacing, and many other things like border radius, media queries, or line heights. And there are many ways to implement design tokens. Could be just SAS variables, or CSS custom properties, or JavaScript variables, or even JSON that you would then convert to formats for different platforms like web or Android or iOS. And now we have a little bit of consistency in our styles, but still, it's not perfect, because not all token combinations are good. For example, we can create a text with very, very small font size, very light text color, and we can add some opacity to it, because why not? We can do anything in CSS. And even if we're using design tokens, it still produces text that is impossible to read, that is inaccessible. And just using CSS and design tokens there, it's very hard to understand how to use these design tokens and which combinations are good and which are not. Can we do better? Yes, of course we can. We should stop writing CSS. And by saying that, I don't mean that CSS is bad or wrong. As I just explained before, I think it's too low level, and we have a better solution. We have components in React. And here, I mean specifically primitive components, and by that, I mean very, very basic components that we can use to compose other more complex components. And I think the most useful primitive components are typography, whitespace, and layout components. And I want to show you a few examples now. First, let's start from typography, and let's try to create a generic text component. Generic text component that we will use to render all text in our app. Here's a couple of examples from existing component libraries like Shopify or I don't know what it is. So what this text component should be able to do? It should be able to render text in different styles, like just a basic text or secondary text that could be gray or small font size. Error text, for example. It depends on your app. Each app will have different number of styles. And the idea here is to find this minimum number of styles that will cover most of use cases for your app. And will make UI more consistent. What else? Would be nice to be able to change an HTML element that is used to render text. Like use, instead of paragraph, use span or something else. Alignment may be useful, maybe not, depends on your app. Whitespace. Would make sense to include whitespace in text component because most likely you will want some whitespace around your text. Text truncation, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe you would want to create a separate component for that, or maybe a prop for text component. Let's think how the API could look for this component. First, how should we select the style? This primary, secondary, looks good? But not really. What is primary, secondary text? Doesn't make sense. So instead of Boolean props, we can have just one prop with all possible styles. And another question here, should we just provide access to all design tokens via component props? I think no, because then we will have the same problems as with CSS. There is no way to understand which combinations of these props are good and which are not. So again, one prop to change the style. So make impossible stays impossible. Make your component hard to use in the wrong way and easy to use in the right way. Next, changing the element. This is one way of doing it. I used to do this and I used to like it, but I think it's not very flexible. You only have 2 elements, and much better to have access to any element like this. Create a separate prop that will define an HTML element or a React component. Would be much more flexible. And here is how our component can look like. The next thing is headings. Also an example of an existing one from View Design System. Pretty cool project. If you're into Vue, check this. Heading is pretty much the same as text, but instead of style or variant, we have a level which will define an appearance, font size, and also we will define an HTML element from H1 to H6. But at the same time, it would be nice to be able to change an HTML element independently from appearance. And this is how it looks. We have heading with heading of the first level, then we have our paragraph of text, and then we have second level heading, and then we have some secondary text. Much better than just writing styles manually. Now, white space. Let's start from defining spacing scale. Spacing scale is basically all spacing values that we're using in our app. And there are two most popular ways to define spacing scale. The first is linear progression, when each value has a fixed increment, like we have 4 pixels, 8 pixels, 12 pixels, 16 pixels, etc. And the next one is geometric progression. It's when each value is 2 times bigger than the previous one. Personally, I think geometric progression is better because values are more distinct from each other and it's easier to choose one. And with linear progression, for example, 24 and 28 pixels are very close to each other. The next thing is naming. There are many ways to name these values. You can use like clause sizes, Greek alphabet, or just numbers. Doesn't matter what you choose, just choose one and use it consistently. All are good. Personally, I like this one with clause sizes. And even better if you use ramps to make your UI more accessible and responsive. So let's start with padding. Let's imagine we have a box component. I don't want to show any real libraries here. I just want to focus on the approach. But at the very end, I will show some links to existing implementations of all these components. So let's imagine we have a box component that have props to define padding. P is padding for all sizes, PT padding top, and like PX is horizontal padding, top, bottom, and no, left, right. And PY is vertical, top and bottom. And the value is the name of this spacing from this spacing scale. And that's how we can use it in our app. So we're creating a button component that renders a box component using the button HTML element, and it has horizontal medium padding and small vertical padding. Exactly the same with margins, but instead of P, we have M, MT, MX, MY. And we use it like this. We have extra large margin below this section and large margin below the heading, and same for the second section. Flexbox. Flex is the same as box, but it has display flex enabled by default, and it has props to define all Flexbox CSS properties like align items, flex direction, etc. And we can use it to define Flexbox layouts using components. Like here we create a form, and then we put an input that occupies all available space, and then we have a button that has a left padding. Now it gets interesting. We can make all these props like margins, paddings, widths, and everything. We can make them responsive. So we can pass an array instead of a single value. For example, here with width. One means it will take 100% width on small screens, and then 50% on medium screens, and quarter on big screens. And same with margins. Small on small screens, medium on medium screens, and large on desktop whatever. And we can make our form responsive. So we're adding flex wrap to the wrapper component, and we're switching paddings and width depending on screen size, viewport size. CSS grid layouts, same as Flexbox, but instead of display flex, we have display grid, and we have props to change all CSS grid properties like gap, grid column, grid row, etc. And we can use it like this to create a very basic photo grid. So we're defining a grid layout with a medium gap between items, and then we define grid template columns with auto fit with minimum width of 200 pixels and maximum width of 100% of the width of the container. And now let's have a look at the example of how can we use all of these components. This is my dog, Siri. She's awesome. And here is the code for this example. Again, we have a grid component that defines grid template columns. We have 3 columns. The middle one is for text. It's auto scales in maximum of 57 characters, which is considered the maximum comfortable width for reading text in English. And then we have left and right columns for white space, which scales from the medium spacing until all the available space. And then we have an image that spans for all 3 columns. We have medium margin below the image, and then we have a text that is placed inside the medium column. And then we have the text exactly as we had it in the previous example. And now let's have a look at an example of implementation of one of components, the text one. They all look pretty much the same. Same idea. Let's see if it will scale. No, it doesn't. Let's try to do this. Okay, so here I'm using styled components, but it doesn't matter what you use. You can use any other CSS and JS solution like JSS or Emotion or whatever, or you can use CSS modules or just plain CSS. Here I'm importing design tokens just from a regular module. With styled components, I would probably use Zine Provider component. Here I'm just importing the module for simplicity. This is kind of base component. All it does is allows you to pass a prop is to change a HTML element or React component that is used to render it. If you're using styled components for it, it works out of the box. You don't need to read it anymore. And now we're defining a styled component using this base component. we define base font size and base line height using our design tokens. And we define font size based on the variant prop passed to this component. And the same way we define the color, also based on the variant prop. And we define default HTML element, which is a paragraph, and default variant which is primary. And to recap the benefits of using components, limited freedom leads to better UI consistency. You have less options to choose from, which makes it easier to choose and makes your UI more consistent. Discoverable API with things like prop types. It's very easy to see how components can be used. Faster development, because you can compose UI from existing primitive components instead of writing CSS manually. Code reuse, again, you already have all these primitive components, and you can use them instead of writing lots of CSS. Easier code reviews. Every time you see any custom CSS user question, can we just use components instead? Or it is really something special and we should use styles. Easier to document with tools like Storybook or Style Guides. You can generate documentation based on prop types, which makes components even easier to use. TypeScript and Fall will give you much better code completion, again increasing ease of use and discoverability of the API. And built-in accessibility. You can hard code all the required accessibility properties into components, and you can enforce people to use accessible colors, and you can block inaccessible combinations of the tokens and font sizes and colors and stuff like that. So this is basically the whole idea of my talk. Hide this nasty CSS in components and never see it again. Just compose your app from these UI components. And that's all. So one last thing, here are a few examples of components that you can just take and use. And this is a link to slides, so you just can go here and check these links and follow me on Twitter. Thank you.